right? Or they're compelling when we haven't really studied the text yet. But one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years in the field is that there's just so much close reading going on and so much more interesting stuff being found in the Book of Mormon than we've ever seen. And at some point, you have to pause and then say, okay, so if you take just Grant Hardy's understanding of the Book of Mormon, take every insight he's got there, does Vogel's theory still work as a theory? And it starts to look like, well, it can account for this, but it can't account for that. And it starts to look a little too sketchy, too broad, right?
Like the
It's
gap.
too, yeah, exactly. And Hardy's book is, of course, just like the very beginning.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's episode. I'm going to be interviewing Joe Spencer, who is a BYU professor. Joe, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I think this will be fun. You've been recommended to me by a couple of people. Robert Boylan and Terrell Gibbons said that you'd be great to have a conversation with about the Book of Mormon, Book of Mormon complexity, and Book of Mormon historicity, which is going to be the main focus of today's interview. So I think this will be really fun, some of the insights and perspectives that you'll have. So I'll just read your bio to open, and then you can go on to tell us a little about your background, anything else about your academic studies, and some of your scholarship about scripture in the Book of Mormon. But I have here that Joseph Spencer, you're a philosopher and an assistant professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, and you have degrees from Brigham Young University, San Jose State University, and the University of New Mexico, and you have a PhD in philosophy from the last institution in 2015, and you're the author of 4 books and the co-editor of 4 collections of essays, and author or co-author of more than 50 articles and book chapters. Is that with BYU Studies?
All over the place. Yeah, lots of different places.
Very good. And your work focuses on both philosophy, theology, and scripture, and you serve as an editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, and as the associate director of the Latter-day Saint Theology Seminar, and as a co-editor for 2 different book series. So quite a busy guy. That's a lot going on. Is there
Yeah,
anything else you
yeah.
want to tell us about maybe your church background, like briefly where you grew up, anything about your academic studies, and then sort of like
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Eastern Washington. I was born in England. My mom's British, but grew up in Eastern Washington in the United States, um, and so in a town that was not predominantly Latter-day Saints, but plenty of Latter-day Saints. And then I went to BYU as an undergraduate. I served a mission in California speaking Spanish, and so had that experience. And then I was not planning on being an academic, so my wife and I opened an independent bookstore for a few years after we finished our bachelor's degrees, and then I kind of bounced around trying to figure out what to do, and then eventually found my way to the academy. Um, and so yeah, I studied philosophy
nice.
primarily along the way, and my PhD's in philosophy. I still write and publish in philosophy, like just straight philosophy as opposed to just like philosophy of religion or and when I do philosophy, I work on contemporary French thoughts, especially. And so yeah, so I do all that kind of thing, and then slowly along the way, I began doing work on Latter-day Saint things, and that sort of eventually became the thing I was doing most of the time, and now more or less all of the time. But it was not quite what I expected at all. But but it's been a really rewarding, uh, yeah, really rewarding thing to do.
And how is it being the editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies?
I've recently finished, so right now it's great because I don't have all that work. But it was a really valuable thing. I worked on that editorial team for a total of 10 years. I was the an associate editor for 4 years, and then the editor for 6. Um, and it was good. I was able to sort of help shape the field and do a lot of thinking about the larger picture of what's happening in Book of Mormon studies and that kind of thing. But it was also just a lot of work. So I'm glad to be done.
Nice. Well, I think you'll bring a unique perspective and expertise and understanding of the scholarship and literature that's been written about the Book of Mormon. So I think this will be great. I did a series last year on the Book of Mormon, sort of myself, I want to explore a lot of the criticisms going against, look at the apologetic defenses, look at some of the evidence in favor, and talk to different either faithful scholars, predominantly faithful scholars, but I talked to a few critics as well, just about the Book of Mormon. But there's always way more to learn. You can never, I think, fully uncover the Book of Mormon, and I still find it fascinating because it is like it's considered the keystone of our religion. Certainly considered to be the convincing evidence for Joseph Smith's prophetic call. But the Book of Mormon, it is a very controversial book because on the one
Yeah.
hand, it's either viewed as like scripture, another testament of Jesus Christ, a translation of an ancient text, or then some would view it as this is just a fraud, 19th century work that either Joseph Smith, who was a 23-year-old, yokel farm boy, just stole from his environment, or he had people conspiring, helping him write it. But then there's some who are more in the middle, who are fair, who may not be believing Latter-day Saints, not LDS scholars, but they see it as Joseph is some sort of a literary genius, and it's quite a complex work of literature, this sort of epic that he produced. But it does seem in the church it's very much this all or nothing proposition. It's either
Often,
the Book of Mormon
yeah.
is either true, it's historical, it's divine, or it's like one of the greatest frauds. What's sort of like your thoughts on that proposition or that dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dichotomy is extreme, obviously, right? Um, uh, I I think there's a lot of good reason that within the faith, there's a kind of nervousness and hence a kind of black and white uh, conception of this, um, because like when you're deeply invested in something as your faith, right? It becomes difficult to sort of concede anything. It can feel like conceding anything is to go to an extreme. So I understand how that culture has arisen, and it's not without a certain value, but it does close out a lot of ways people can come at things. Um, so I do think it's a strange dichotomy in a lot of ways that it's either 100% perfectly clear and perfect and so on, right? Or it's 100% nonsense. That just seems not a lot of things in the world that are that way. So it seems strange that we want to treat the Book of Mormon that way.
Right.
Um, that said, like what the middle ground positions are, or available middle ground positions, like it's actually, I think, a really complicated thing. And so few people have inhabited those middle ground positions in productive ways that there aren't a lot of sort of ready examples to draw on to say, well, here are other ways people might make sense of this, um, that yeah, that aren't going to extremes, if you will.
Right. I want to talk about Book of Mormon historicity. I want to set that aside for the moment. I do want to talk about that later. But I think people like, for example, Grant Hardy, I finished reading his book. And at the very beginning, he was almost like, you can approach this book either by viewing it as historical or ancient, or Joseph being the author. But he very much opened my mind, I think, both for believers, but also for non believers, to appreciate the complexity of
Mm,
the Book of Mormon as well. And I think it's very tempting when people lose faith in it to just see it as like trash or nonsense or Bible fan fiction as well. But actually, like hearing the work of people like that who really studied the text does actually show, like, wow, this is actually quite a complex and coherent text,
right,
whether or not you want to believe it is ancient, divine, and historical or work of fiction. There's a lot more to it than that dichotomy. It's either all true and perfect or it's all trash and made up.
right. Yeah, what Grant Hardy has been able to do is he'll use the word of the language of bracketing, right? He'll say there is this sort of black and white issue, but he'll just say, I just don't, for our purposes here, we're just not going to talk about black and white issue, right? It is either Joseph Smith's creation or it is divine. And he's like, but here, there's all kinds of things we can talk about that just don't address that issue. And that's a lot of what's happened in Book of Mormon studies in the last 20 years. Most people writing in Book of Mormon studies just aren't addressing the question, the black and white question. They're addressing other things. And so assuming that the book has something interesting to say and that there's stuff to investigate here, we just don't make that question, the black and white question, the question, right? So that's what a lot of people have done. Grant Hardy sort of paved the way or opened that space in a lot of ways.
Mm,
Um, that said, there are lots of there are other ways than just the bracketing way of approaching this. I think what Hardy's done there is really interesting and productive. Um, But there are other ways to come at it too that aren't. They're similar in that they don't think the black and white question is the only question, but they don't simply say we're going to bracket that and ask about its literary form or its complexity. Uh, there are other approaches like what's been done with reception history or what's been done with theology, or so there's some other ways of coming at it than just asking about its literary complexity. But there's a but really Hardy's kind of opened that door, right? And lots of
Right.
people.
And I know whenever I read through Terrell Given's book, he talked about how, especially in the early years of the church, that the Book of Mormon seemed to be used more as like a sign or an evidence of like Joseph being a prophet, rather than people really deeply analyzing the text and like the message and the theology. And it seems to like people like yourself, Grant Hardy, and others who are really doing this deep textual analysis into the message of the Book of Mormon, some of the textual consistency, the difference were like authors and voices as well throughout the book more, and the different messages. So I thought maybe we could start off with maybe you sharing what are some things that you find very noteworthy about the text complexity, things which you find just compelling about being very coherent or sort of like textually consistent and sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying there are aspects of the Book of Mormon that simply don't come clear till you ask the right question, right? And in a lot of ways, what one way I'd cast what Terrell Givens is showing there in our history with the Book of Mormon is that just for a long time we just didn't ask. There's a whole series of questions or a whole host of questions we just never asked, and as a result, the Book of Mormon showed up in a certain way, right? In the same sense that if I just never asked the right question of this person, they're never going to give me the answer I might have wanted, right? And we did this to the Book of Mormon. The only question we really asked is, like, what's the doctrine, or is the thing historical or not? Like, right? These are, in some sense, the only questions we asked for a long time. And in a lot of ways, even the question, what is the doctrine, was a kind of secondary question. We tended to look to other sources to try to construct the doctrine of the church.
Mm.
So mostly we just didn't ask a lot of the Book of Mormon. So what's happened these last, couple of decades is we began asking a lot of the Book of Mormon.
Because
Grant
I view
Hardy's work,
myself as a missionary, that
huh?
often we would have taught from the Book of Mormon as well, like scripture passages and things, but the Book of Mormon was very much used as like conversion tool, like, read, pray about the Book of Mormon, you'll receive a spiritual witness, and then you'll know Joseph Smith was a prophet, and that this is the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and was kind of used as like this conversion tool to bring people into the church rather than to really teach about like the messages contained in the Book of Mormon.
Exactly. Yeah. So the kinds of questions that have been posed in recent years are bringing out a lot of interesting things. Hardy's approach has been to ask about, I mean, what scholars would call narratology, right? What is Nephi's style of writing? How does he tell a story? What's the literary shape of his narrative style? And that's brought out really amazing things. His book, Understanding the Book of Mormon, is dynamite. I mean, it's just really phenomenal work. Um, the majority of what's going on in the field right now is actually more theological in orientation.
Mm.
And so the kind of thing, and that's the kind of work I've done. And what's happening there is that you ask theological questions of the book, but you ask that with an eye to how the book is organized and how the organization or form or shape of the book governs its theological message. So most of the stuff I found in there that I've just found very compelling and so on, both at a spiritual level but also at an intellectual level, concerns that. So I've done a good deal of work of just trying to figure out, rather than reading just like a passage or a chapter, what's the shape of a whole book? Does the Book of Alma have a structure,
Right.
organization? What is Mormon doing if he's telling a story that's unique within that book and he's started it here and he's ended it here for some reason? Or if Nephi decides to divide his record into two books, First Nephi and Second Nephi, why? What does each book contribute, and how is each organized, and so on? And then once you've got a kind of organization, you can ask something about how there's a message built into that. In the same way that, like, if I'm watching a film, right? If it starts here, but then the flashback comes at that moment, and then it comes back to this, like, the meaning of the film is built into that structure. And so that's the kind of work that is, at least that I've especially done. And it seems to me the Book of Mormon has a pretty amazingly organized project. and messages that are consistent across the book, and often just far more nuanced than even believers expect.
Yeah, I remember reading about, and I think this might have came from Grant Hardy's book as well, was, the book of Second Nephi, how
Mhm.
carefully textually constructed it seems. Because often you might read it and just think, well, Nephi's just putting in some filler material from Isaiah for 13 chapters because he doesn't know what to write. And how, like, the last few chapters of Second Nephi with some of the prophecies from Nephi, he seems to be drawing upon some of the things, but also some of the language, not just from the Isaiah chapters, but also the Joseph of Egypt prophecy as well, and how this sort of shows that, like, even if you want to believe Joseph is the author, he's not just like making it up on the fly. Like, it is very carefully textually constructed and very
Yes,
very coherent message. And that was something that I would never have got just from reading the Book of Mormon chapter by chapter. Like you said, you kind of have to see not just each chapter, each page, but like what it's doing as a book.
exactly. Yeah, the example that's I think easiest to illustrate this and looking at a book by book project is the Book of Alma. The Book of Alma is actually organized in an intensely structured way. In the original chaptering, it's exactly 30 chapters, and the first 15 start with the story of Nehor, and the second set of 15 starts with the story of Korihor, as if the book halfway through starts to tell you very similar stories. You get these stories of figures who interrupt all this stuff for the church, and both of them end up in a trial, and both of them end up dead, and they have these followers. Right after the story of Nehor, you get the story of the Amlicites who have this rebellion and they cause a civil war. Right after Korihor story, you get the Zoramites who cause a civil war as dissenters and so on. Right after the Amlicites, you get three sermons that Alma gives in Zarahemla and in Gideon and in Ammonihah. And right after the Zoramite situation, you get three sermons where he sits down with his three sons, Helaman and Shiblon and Corianton. And literally, it seems he's divided the book into two halves and run each half parallel side by side,
Right.
uh,
So
and it
interesting.
organizes the thing and it suggests, oh, I'm supposed to be comparing Nehor and Korihor, the Amlicites and the Zoramites, these three sermons with these three sermons. And there's a project, right? There's a project. And it's so easy to miss when we're looking at a verse or just a chapter. The whole thing has a structure and a project and a mission. Right?
Yeah, and it really shows how carefully it was planned and constructed. And this is just not something that was just whipped up, either Joseph dictating on the fly or ancient authors just writing on the fly. It was very carefully put together. I find the different editorial voices very interesting as well. How Mormon almost seems to have a slightly different, while they all have the same sort of goal to try to point us and convert us to Christ, how Mormons seem to be more focused on like his history and showing like
Mhm.
how the words of prophets were fulfilled and very much the important spiritual messages found in the stories. And you see like sort of like small editorial sort of comments by like, oh, and thus we see dot dot
Mhm.
dot. Whereas like Moroni, his approach seems to be less concerned about the history, or it's a bit, the historical narrative is a bit shorter than what we see in Mormon's account, and very much more concerned about convincing people by like the spirit. That's ultimately how
Yeah.
you come to know these things are true. Which I suppose you could still attribute that to maybe stylistic drift from Joseph as the author, but it's very interesting that it appears that their styles are not the same. Probably with Nephi as well, are not
Yeah.
exactly the same, which again adds to the complexity of the text.
I think that's right. And they each seem to have different projects. What Hardy's looked at is their different sort of narrative styles and so on, but their projects are actually significantly different. Nephi's project is primarily prophetic, right?
Right.
His I think First Nephi is very clearly a kind of introduction of what he's seen of the last days and starting to tangle it up with Isaiah. And then Second Nephi is like, now let's go seriously into Isaiah and look at what all this means about the redemption of Israel in the last days. But his primary purpose is prophetic. Whereas Mormon, yeah, Mormon's telling an ancient story, right? He wants to tell you a story of the Nephites and from the rise of this church and through the first waves of Lamanite converts to the total conversion of the Lamanite nation to Christ's visit. But what he's doing, it seems, is telling you a kind of ancient story that's supposed to mirror the story Nephi's told about the last days. So Nephi just gives you prophecy. Boom, here's how the Lamanites will be redeemed in the last days. And then Mormon tells you a story about how they were once redeemed, right? And then walks you through that right up until Christ comes. And then Moroni is like, forget Israel. I'm going to talk about Gentiles. And he tells the story of the Jaredites, who are non Israelite people, but he's looking at that then in order to think about Gentiles in the last days. They're all circling around the same set of questions: who is Christ? And how is Israel's covenant going to be fulfilled? but they're all doing it in very different ways. Do you do it prophetically? Do you do it by telling a narrative about an ancient Israelite people? Or do you concern yourself with Gentiles and the message that needs to be delivered to them? Yeah, so they've all got, they're looking at the same project, but from very, very different angles.
Yeah, super fascinating. What are your thoughts on like some of the arguments for complexity? I would often, read this on like places like maybe Book of Mormon or Scripture Central. They would talk about like, the geographical complexity and all the geographical references, very internally consistent geography. There's complex chiasmus, there's flashbacks and overlapping narratives and different sets of place and record keepers and different calendar systems. And sometimes, that would sort of be used to bolster not just the complexity, but to say, well, this seems far too complex to have come from a 23-year-old farm boy. Sort of like an argument that supports it being ancient and divine. What are your thoughts on that? Like, I think you would acknowledge the complexity. Do you think that this supports the divinity or authenticity of the Book of Mormon, or do you not like to get into that sort of argument? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's important to recognize what different kinds of evidence do for different kinds of people, right? Um, I mean, there's a lovely story in the Book of Mormon about exactly this issue, right? This is the story of Korihor and Alma. When they have this confrontation, Alma will say things like, "Well, just look at like the planets moving and so on. Isn't this evidence of
Right,
God?"
yeah, yeah.
And Korihor's like, "No," right?
Yeah, everything
Um,
denotes there's a God.
yeah, exactly. And Alma seems to be saying something like, "Well, look at this complexity. Doesn't that tell you?" And Korihor's like, "Uh-uh." And I think it's an interesting little face-off within the Book of Mormon itself. Um, Evidence is not absolute. Evidence is not objective. Evidence is a question of what convinces you, given your prior beliefs and your framework and where you're coming from and what questions you're asking. Um, which is not to say it's merely subjective, but it's not. There's no sort of neutral realm out there where we can simply go adjudicate the truth of the Book of Mormon and move on.
Mm.
Instead, this is a question of winning hearts and souls and so on. So the complexity of the Book of Mormon to me is a very profound and moving evidence that this is divine and that these prophets are doing something and so on. But I totally understand how someone who comes at the Book of Mormon with a different set of presuppositions doesn't see any of that in there. Just like Korihor would say, I don't see anything in that. That's your faith speaking. Um, so I have friends who are Book of Mormon scholars who are not and never have been members of the church. Right? They grew up in other faith traditions or completely outside of religion, but they find the Book of Mormon fascinating as a literary product or whatever. Uh, and it would feel to me sort of inappropriate to tell them, but don't you see how this is evidence, right? I think they would
Yeah,
feel like,
there's no way. There's no other way. Um,
yeah, they would just be like, that's interesting, right? I see how it means that for you, but it's not a neutral ground where we can just be like evidence, evidence, evidence. It's
yeah.
a different kind of thing.
I liked how you said how there's a couple of things you said that are really really insightful. I like how you said that evidence can be a subjective thing, and I agree with that because I remember doing a video a while ago on is there archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. I think when people often ask that, they want sort of like absolute historical proof, like undeniable. But
Yep.
evidence can be quite subjective. To one person, they might think like it converges and correlates really well, that this seems like evidence or sort of like plausible in favor. It sort of supports belief. While someone else might just think it's a coincidence or you're sort of just finding parallels. It doesn't, yeah, they just don't find it compelling. Or even when it comes to like the textual complexity, there might be some people who might agree, like, oh, yeah, this is quite a complex work. And I think it definitely makes what Joseph did more impressive in light of it being, less than 85 days. According to witnesses, no notes or manuscript. He appeared to be looking at either one or two stones, likely in a hat. So it's quite makes it more impressive if this just came from him, but it doesn't necessarily prove it that it is divine or historical. But it certainly, I think, can make your sort of spiritual belief. It can enhance it and make it more intellectually defendable and stronger in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, right? Uh, there's a question of really in all these questions about proof and evidence and so on and so forth. There's a question of rationality, and it's absolutely the case that as I read the complexity of the Book of Mormon and see it, there's a sense in which it helps me feel that my convictions, which are not intellectual convictions, it helps me feel like they're at least rational, right?
Right.
Um, they're defensible. I'm not crazy, right? Or
Yeah.
being hoodwinked or something like that.
Not that it's
But
the
that doesn't
foundation
mean
for your belief, but it
exactly.
strengthens it.
But it does strengthen it, right? And it does help me feel like I can sort of hold my head up. And when someone says, aren't you nuts for believing this? I can be like, well, I've got my reasons, right? Not just a conviction that's spiritual, but I've also got reasons. But I don't have to therefore be like, and those reasons mean you're an idiot if you don't, right? Like it just doesn't work that way. Um, it's a different kind of thing.
Right. So, is there anything else you want to say about Book of Mormon complexity before we maybe transition to Book of Mormon historicity? Any other insights or comments you'd like to share?
Yeah. I mean,
There's probably
maybe
so
just
much,
in
but
there's a lot. Yeah. But maybe just the general thing to say is like, we're just beginning.
yeah,
The field has only really begun taking the text of the Book of Mormon seriously in the last 2 decades. And it's a small field. It's not like we've got 600 people working on this all the time. It's a small field. So, really, like, we're going to find out in 50 years just how complex the Book of Mormon is. Right now, we're just starting to see some things, but the kind of work that's going on is revealing over and over and over again just how rich and deep this book is, whether wherever one's coming at it from. The thing deserves a lot more attention than it's received.
yeah, and I think everyone can benefit and be enriched from the reading of the Book of Mormon, no matter what perspective you come from, by taking into account the scholarship on the textual complexity and intricacy of the Book of Mormon. So I do want to transition to talking a little about historicity, particularly when it comes to like the truth claims, and I think this is very important for Latter-day Saints who people who want to really determine if they believe that this is of divine origin, if this is really what Joseph Smith claimed. So I want to get your first thoughts. How important do you think this question of historicity is in terms of belief? Maybe not so much in like studying the text from like a scholarly sort of point of view, but in terms of belief, how important and integral is Book of Mormon historicity versus if someone might take the position of I just see it more as like inspired fiction, teaches good principles, but I don't believe it's historical. How key or integral do you think Book of Mormon historicity is to Latter-day Saint belief?
Yeah. Okay, so I have a complicated answer to this question. Um,
Sorry, it's a complicated question, so that's all
it
right.
is, yeah. Um, so the question of historicity really, I feel like is shaped the same way as questions like, have you stopped beating your children? Right? Um, if I ask someone, have you stopped beating your children? I assume something in the question, right? And that's why it can be an offensive question to somebody. They're like, well, I've never beaten my children. The right answer to that is neither yes nor no, right? Have you stopped beating your children? Yes. Well, then, oh, so you were beating them. Or have you stopped beating them? No. Oh, so you're still beating them. I assume something with the question. And I think this is actually what's going on with historicity. When the question is posed, is the Book of Mormon historical? It assumes something that people don't tend to recognize as getting assumed. It assumes that history is the framework for understanding the truth of the Book of Mormon. Uh, and for my money, that's just patently false. That is just the most ridiculous way to make sense of the Book of Mormon in the end. And so I think there's a complexity here. We have long assumed culturally that that history is the measure of whether the Book of Mormon is valuable slash true slash whatever you have. Um, but frankly, that's a framework for understanding the Book of Mormon that came from critics in the first place. It didn't come from believers. Um, it was, oh well, tell me this book is historical, and then believers assumed the same framework and then began to respond. And the result is that we've given 100 years of intellectual work to defending the historicity of the Book of Mormon on the grounds that were established by critics. Um, I think, frankly, this was a mistake collectively on the part of Latter day Saints. I don't think history is the right framework for making sense of the book. Um, it does present itself as an ancient text, um,
Right.
but that doesn't amount to then the way we decide that this text is the right kind of text is by establishing it on secular historical grounds. Yeah, it just seems to me like totally the wrong question. But it's become so dominant culturally as the question that as a result, if you say something like, "I'm not sure historicity is the issue," people think you sound crazy, right? So I think this is actually it's a pretty deep problem in our reception of the Book of Mormon, and this is in a lot of ways what Gibbons is trying to track in his book, right? From the very beginning, if the book is a sign of Joseph Smith's prophetic gifts, then we've got to establish the truth of the book in order to know the truth of the prophet's message. Well, how do you decide the truth of the book? History. Um, but this just seems to me totally the wrong question. Totally the
Hmm.
wrong question. So it's a difficult issue. Like, I'm convinced of myself. I'm convicted of the historicity of the Book of Mormon. How much does it matter to me? Not much, right? It's just not the issue at all. Um, the issue is the prophetic message of the book, what it's actually saying about how a life of faith works, the portrait it's giving us of who Jesus Christ is and what he does, how it predicts the fulfillment of Israel's covenants. And so, like, this is the actual meaning and substance of the book. Historicity is at best a kind of interesting side game
Hmm.
or something like this.
So
At
I
least
want to
that's where
try
I
and
stand.
understand you like where you come from, because I think some people would probably feel that yeah, what convinced me that the Book of Mormon is true and divine is either a spiritual witness or from reading the text and the inspiring messages or the doctrine or that connection they feel to God. So that
Right?
might be, shall we say, the foundation for their
Mhm.
testimony. Me growing up, the first before I sort of got into my faith crisis, which was after my mission, that would have been the foundation for my testimony of the Book of Mormon. It's very much spiritual. It's very much connecting with God through reading and reading these stories. But I would have believed the Book of Mormon was historical, but I never would have thought about it. If that makes sense, I never
Mhm.
would have
Right.
thought about where it took place. Is there archaeological evidence? Is there anachronisms against? But at the same time, I always would have believed because, you know, the witnesses claim to have then, you know, seen plates by an angel. The Joseph Smith story, you know, the angel comes, said that there's plates deposited in a hill. It's a record of ancient inhabitants, you know, of this continent. So some might think, are you trying to say, well, don't worry about historicity because the book can't almost be like defended as a historical text? Or are you saying that that's not the best approach to determine its authenticity?
Yeah, the latter, right? Um, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an historian, first of all, so I don't know how responsibly the Book of Mormon can be defended in terms of historicity. Uh, and I actually think it should concern us collectively that to establish the historicity of the Book of Mormon requires a host of PhDs arguing in really intense ways. And I just want to say, like, is this how? I don't know what God would work this way, right? It's like that he's going to send something into the world, the truth of which has to be decided by a bunch of obscure
Do you feel like it
PhDs.
should almost be like self-evident?
Not necessarily that it would be self-evident, but that the grounds are very different than
Mm.
that, right? So, I mean, it would be the to give a kind of analogy, it would be like God sending a message into the world and then saying, now the only way that this can be decided is if you get a bunch of chemists with the right kind of laboratory equipment, and then they all do their experiments and so on, and then they have to announce to the world, now you know that God has spoken. That'd be a very strange thing, but that's actually what we've collectively bought into. I think with the Book of Mormon is we're like, no, 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 it's a bunch of obscure, like, what do you know of ancient Mesoamerican history? Do you know this Northwest Semitic root word and whether that's reflected in this part of the book? Like, these are the grounds on which we're deciding the truth of the Book of Mormon. Um, that seems like a very, very strange thing, but we've been doing it so long culturally
Mm.
that it feels normal or natural, I think, to us. But it's actually a very strange idea that I think if we went back and redid our history, so to speak, we would probably wonder how on earth we got there. Um, yeah, so what I really mean is that the truth of the Book of Mormon, I think, is just a totally different kind of question than a historical question. Um,
Right. I
the
got you. 'Cause,
historical
for
question,
example, like say someone from maybe a third world country who is given a Book of Mormon and maybe doesn't have access to maybe internet or you know all this scholarship that's been done on the Book of Mormon, things trying to prove historicity, they wouldn't have access to that, so they can't determine the truth of it by a
right,
historical approach. And
right,
ultimately, the book claims and invites people that the real way to really come to know of its truthfulness is the spiritual approach, but that it also claims to be an ancient text. So I want to ask this question because some people might hold the view of like, I don't think we'll be able to prove the Book of Mormon definitively through
Mhm.
archaeological evidence or
Right.
prove its historicity, because they believe that, theologically, that God wouldn't do that. He wouldn't prove. Similar with Jesus's resurrection, there's evidence that Jesus likely was a historical person. We know that Jerusalem exists. We have testimony of eyewitnesses, but he's not proven it to the world. And that
Right.
some might think that with the Book of Mormon, we find maybe some interesting evidence that seems to converge. I personally think that Old World geography and Arabia does converge quite well with First Nephi. I'm not going to say absolute undeniable bullseye, but I think the convergence, particularly from Nahum to Bountiful, it seems to fit very well.
Yep.
But then some might think, well, God, he wouldn't provide maybe absolute proof, but maybe some compelling evidence to support spiritual belief, but not enough to settle it one way or the other for the world, in a way. What do you think about that paradigm or that view?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And frankly, I think the Book of Mormon itself says that, right? You've got this really interesting passage in Second Nephi 27, where Nephi is he's wrestling with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon in the last days. So he's prophesying of last days kind of thing and so on. And he talks about he distinguishes between the book and the words of the book. It's a really nuanced little passage, but he talks about the book being sealed and it's not made available to the world and so on, but the words of the book are going to be in circulation, right? And Joseph will be able to give the words of the book to people and those can circulate, but the book won't be.
As in like
Um,
the plates
yeah,
basically,
exactly.
right?
So yeah, the book seems to be the plates, right? And the words of the book is like the published Book of Mormon.
Mm,
Um, and then he gives this story that we always connect to Charles Anthony, right? Where he says this person who's got the book will give the words of the book to another, and it'll show them to the learned, and the learned will say, "Bring hither the book, and I will read them." I can't bring you the book; it's sealed. Well, then the learned can't read them, right? And we tend to read that, and we're like, "Oh, Charles Anthony." Um, but actually, I think this is a marvelous little parable, like a theological parable, right? The world doesn't get the plates, and that's by divine design, right?
yeah.
Instead, they get the words.
And I think in that
Um,
specific chapter, it also talks about that God will choose 3 witnesses and a few others according to the will of God. But yeah, the rest of
but
the world
that's it,
aren't allowed to see the plates. And that's a very common criticism. I've done some recent videos on the gold plates, and I've interviewed like Stephen Smoot and Neil Rapley, and I've done some responses. And one of the most common criticisms is if Joseph had plates, he would have shown them to everybody and he could have proven the Book of
right?
Mormon. And God, if you
Right.
believe that this is, scripture, seem to be against that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You've got a passage in the Book of Mormon that says, no, that's not how it would work. Yeah, this is going to be limited to just a few. And then it's very explicit in the text, right? I mean, Nephi attributes this to the voice of God and has God say, um, I work by faith. I work the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I'm going to show unto the world that I work by miracles and I work only according to the faith uh, of, of human beings. And so I think the Book of Mormon itself theorizes this, if you will, and says, no, like, God is not going to give definitive evidence. He's not going to give you a kind of knockdown proof. He gives you a bunch of words, a few witnesses that said they saw this stuff. So that should give you reason to take this seriously. But then the question is, what do you make of these words? Um, and that I think is very much by design. Again, as we were talking about before, that's not something you can then hand to somebody and say, there, that proves anything, right? It says proof here is a question of whether one develops conviction, not a question of objectively available, scientifically testable evidence, which is what we're doing when we talk about historicity usually. Can we get some kind of objective, universally neutral, non-biased account that's going to just decide this question one way or the other? And the Book of Mormon says, no, no, we're not going to do that. The
Mm.
decision is made on other grounds here.
Right. What are your thoughts on, there's two main, I think, geography proponents. There's the Heartland geography model, more in like North America, like the Great Lakes region. And then there's the Mesoamerican model. I've actually been interviewing a couple of guys who have a slightly varied model to the John Sorensen model. It's the Rio Passion model, very much trying to find evidence or things which seem to converge with certain geographies with the text of the Book of Mormon. I personally find it interesting. I find it quite fascinating. I don't expect to find, a definitive geography with archaeological evidence, but I'm interested in hearing like the best sort of theories and what they sort of argue to support their theory. What do you think about those people who are very much focused on that sort of work, the geography, and very much trying to find the historicity? Do you think it can take away from the book? Do you think it's also an important work? What's your thoughts on the different geographical theories, I guess, for the Book of Mormon? Because the
Good.
church does not
Yeah.
have an official position. They're basically said you can sort of, we just say it happened somewhere in the Americas, something that happened in Heartland, so in Mesoamerica. We're pleading the fifth. We don't have a
Right.
we don't have a case.
Yeah. I mean, for my money, um, as soon as a geographical model helps me understand the actual text of the Book of Mormon in an interesting and productive way, uh, then I'll be excited. Until then, I just can't even get interested, right? So if someone has a geographical model and they're like, oh, once we dig into this archaeology, it shows us that we're reading Abinadi wrong. It actually would mean, well, then, okay, that's
Hmm.
interesting. But until then, this feels like a hobby. And so I don't think it's problematic. I don't think it's bad. I wouldn't criticize anyone for doing it, but it's from where I'm sitting, it's kind of hobbyish. I'm not going to criticize someone for deciding they want to make violins on the side and shape the wood and blah, 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 right? Cool, great. That's a cool thing to do with your time. Book of Mormon geography, fun, cool. That's a cool thing to do with your time. It probably has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon.
Hmm.
Certainly not with its message or its meaning, or at least it hasn't yet. Like I say, if someone digs up something and they're like, oh, if we take this and it connects to this, that text reads very differently. I'm all ears. But until then, it really feels kind of beside the point, especially when like we haven't scratched the surface of the actual meaning of the book, the complexity of the book, the theological force of the book. There's so much intellectual effort going into what's really a side issue. And like I say, hobbies, cool. But if we're talking about moving forward in the Book of Mormon studies or really understanding the book, I think it's all genuinely beside the point.
Hmm. I think the tough thing as
Uh,
well is that in order to say if you're trying to find Book of Mormon cities or make a geography, it always probably will start with like finding parallels and trying to find correlations, which isn't always considered the best methodology, but it seems like you kind of would have to do that in order to like find one that would work. I remember like one thing I found interesting, I think it was in Brent Gardner's book, and he's obviously more of a Mesoamerica proponent, but there's a scripture, I think in the Book of Helaman, where it talks about like Nephi going into like a tower in his garden, and it's like next to a highway that leads to a cheap marketplace. And whenever I read that in his book, I was like, it's not even in the Book of Mormon. I was like, I don't think I've ever noticed that. So I flicked to the Book of Mormon, found the passage. I was like, oh, there it is. I was like, I guess I just skimmed over that. Like, well,
yeah,
that's unimportant nonsense. And he said that actually kind of like fit in a Mesoamerica context. Those things might have existed. And that's one thing where I was like, okay, this isn't like, okay, this settles it. Book of Mormon is historical and took place in Mesoamerica. But I find those sorts of things quite interesting.
yeah,
Some things that might you might be able to make sense of understanding the culture or the context, and some of that's interesting, but then there's always limitations to can we prove this definitively.
exactly, exactly. So if it's in the service of trying to garner evidence, then I'm really bored, right? But if it's in the service of like, no, we can make sense of this culture, and that might actually mean something. So an example where I think someone's come close to this is some of the work that's been done on um, say various kinds of secret cults things or secret, I mean, what we would call secret combinations in the Book of Mormon. If we look at these in various contexts in ancient America and just look at how those practices worked, does that help us understand the Book of Helaman? That seems to me really valuable
Hmm.
because the Book of Helaman is saying something about what role this is playing in a certain society or something. And okay, so if you can give me an account of what this looks like anciently and that actually genuinely clarifies the text, awesome. Uh, but more often than not, it's sort of like, look, there are ancient societies. So the Book of Mormon's uh, right?
So I'm
That
curious,
just doesn't.
what are your thoughts on, because I think probably when apologists or faithful scholars try to argue archaeological evidence, I think probably their strongest case is in the old world, particularly with
Yes.
Lehi's travel from Jerusalem to the Red Sea. They have plausible locations for like Shazer, and where is it like the Valley of Lemuel, and then sort of like going like a southeastern direction to Nahum, NHM on an altar. It seems to be in the right location. Then they turn to the eastward to bountiful. For me, I don't see it as like proof, but I kind of see it as like, man, this does converge very well with the Book of Mormon. This
It
would be
does.
really coincidental. Do you see that as bullseye? Do you see it kind of like, okay, converges pretty well, or do you see it more as like, oh, it doesn't really matter for me, and maybe it's just kind of like parallels? What's sort of like your take on something like that?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think if I'm trying to give an objective account of it, I think it's a strong convergence. Is probably the best way to just answer that question plainly, right?
Right.
Um, how often does it help me understand the Book of Mormon? That sort of depends, right? Yeah, and so I do think you're right.
It's a
The
separate
convergences are
issues.
much clearer, yeah,
Right. Right.
there. But yeah, like when I'm reading First Nephi, how much does it help me understand Nephi's project? Is like that's my central question, and so and sometimes it does. If you go all the way back to the first person to look at the Arabian connections, which is Hugh Nibley back in the 1950s, um, he does some really nice work of saying, well, let's look at desert culture, let's dig this all out, and then he says, notice how all of this imagery is showing up in the dream of the tree,
Right.
uh, and you're like, oh wow, that dream suddenly pops in a way it didn't. If I'm seeing this as desert storms and how do you find water in this desert, and Lehi is his anxieties are manifesting in this very familiar imagery. Oh, that's helpful. That helps me understand the text in a way that I might have been a little lost before. Um, but in terms of just like, oh, now we can locate at Nahum or something like that is like, cool, very interesting, very, very interesting. Does it help me understand the text at all?
Right.
Um, and that, so yeah, so it's, I mean, when the Nahum thing came up, I was just in my undergrad or whatever when that was found, and it was this sort of like whoa, right now this like wow, the first like really bullseye-ish kind of evidence of the Book of Mormon's historicity and so on. And it was, I mean, yeah, it really is a fascinating convergence. Is it enough to convince people? And the answer is no. It's not an objective.
No.
Here's the thing. This proves everything. But it is a kind of thing that makes you go, okay, cool. I'm not crazy. Now back to work, right?
Right.
What does the text say?
Yeah.
So
The text is at least not inconsistent with old world geography. You don't see many critics who, if they're attacking the Book of Mormon, it's not usually old world geography. Before we move on to, I want to talk a little about the text and maybe like translation, sort of like controversies or complexity. But uh, to finish off, what would you say to someone who would say, why are you believing in a book that there's no archaeological evidence to support it at all? And there's, say, anachronisms, historical anachronisms in the text, physical anachronisms. I'm sure you hear that. I hear that a lot. What would be sort of like your quick response to someone saying you're believing in a fictional text that there's no archaeological evidence to support?
I mean, I think I'd say something like, you're misunderstanding what it is to believe in a text, right? Um, and I think an analogy I've used with students sometimes or others is if you think about relationships, it's something more like that. It would be a very strange thing if I spent all of my time in my relationship with my wife looking for evidences that she loves me. Um, that would be a very disastrous thing for our relationship, right? If I'm scrutinizing all of her words or only listening to words that might evidence that she does love me or that she doesn't love me, and if I'm kind of constantly putting her to a test, if I, if I, yeah, if anything that crops up that starts to look bad, I get anxious and start acting differently. And every time something looks good, then I'm elated and so on. Like that would be a really problematic way to relate to my wife. The Book of Mormon is more like someone in a relationship than it is like an object in a scientific laboratory. It's not a dead object that we're probing with certain instruments and gathering certain observations. It's something more like a living conversation partner. And if I'm relating to it in that kind of way, I've misunderstood what it is to relate to a text like this. This is more like my wife. If all I'm ever doing is picking out the bits and pieces that suggest it's historicity or not, and then getting excited or sad about that, I've got a weird relationship to this book. Um, it's a different kind of thing than that.
Mm. No, I actually resonate with that because you're saying that if that's sort of like the main focus or sort of like your main foundation for belief, might one week feel really strong on believing the Book of Mormon if you're maybe reading about some of the best evidence in favor, and then next week if you look at all the problems and challenges, then that might totally interfere with your belief in your relationship, your faith in it, which might take away what the main purpose is. So I want to get your thoughts on, there's King James Bible language in the Book of Mormon, some King James Bible passages, not always like direct plagiarisms, but certainly King James Bible material in the Book of Mormon. And people would say that this is clear that it's Joseph borrowing from the King James Bible from his day. You've got some New Testament sounding material like Moroni 7 and Moroni 10, very, very similar, if not identical, to some passages in Paul. And people might see it as either textual anachronisms or fingerprints that this is just a product of the 19th century and that Joseph is the author. What's sort of your view and your take when it comes, because this kind of complexity, I guess you could say, in the text of handling King James Bible material that some might view as anachronistic or 19th century in the Book of Mormon?
I mean, I actually think there's a pretty simple answer to this question, though whether it satisfies everyone is always an open question. But I think it's actually just this simple. The Book of Mormon, that is the English text of the Book of Mormon, is a 19th century text, period.
Yeah.
Right? If it's a translation of an ancient text, it's a 19th century translation of an ancient text. And so the King James Bible has been available for centuries at that point and is a ready source for a translation into English, period. Right? So I just think it's actually irrelevant to the question in the end that there's King James stuff all over the Book of Mormon. There ought to be. What language was you translated into? Right? Yeah, exactly. So what's being assumed when it's made a question of the truth of the book, I think, is that the Book of Mormon would somehow ignore the linguistic culture into which it's being translated, which just seems to me crazy talk, right? If I read a translation of Plato that was done in the 1950s and it uses language of Cold War politics, that makes perfect sense. But it would be very strange to be like, well, then Plato didn't exist, right? Like, of course, you're seeing the relevance of a certain era and context, and the translation is going to speak to that. So, so it always feels to me like it's a strange worry, though I get how people get there, but I think it's a strange worry, really, in the end. Like, it ought to be riddled with the King James Bible. Now, there are places where that can get really tricky and that requires more work or something, but on the whole, it just seems to me like it's just not the issue at all.
Okay. Before I bring up the Deutero-Isaiah big controversy with biblical scholarship, we touched on earlier that Isaiah is quoted throughout the Book of Mormon, not just in Second Nephi, but some of the themes make their way through the Book of Mormon, particularly the gathering and then the restoring of Israel again. Do you want to touch on just how you see the Book of Mormon using the prophet Isaiah and how you think that supports either just complexity or just the intricacy of the text?
Yeah, I mean, this has been my work constantly for the last 15 years. And maybe I should plug my most recent book. I don't know.
Do it.
I just published a book last year called A Word in Season, Isaiah's Reception in the Book of Mormon with the University of Illinois Press, where I try to, I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm actually just trying to clear the ground and start the whole question of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon over completely in that book.
Excellent. You're the man to talk to you about Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, then.
Yeah. And what my argument of that book, and it's worth saying, like, this is published by the University of Illinois. This is not an insider press kind of thing, right? But my argument in that book is that if we set aside for a moment the question of what Isaiah's presence in the Book of Mormon proves about its antiquity or its modernity, if we just set that question aside and ask, what is Isaiah doing in the Book of Mormon? Like, what role does it play? How does it shape the project? How is the book interacting with Isaiah? It turns out that it's doing, one, really interesting things, all kinds of really interesting things, and I give 300 pages to that. But two, it actually stages an argument that, I mean, maybe two arguments, I would say. It stages, one, an argument that the book of Isaiah doesn't have one meaning, it has many. The Book of Mormon takes it'll take the same passage from Isaiah and in 3 or 4 different contexts interpret it in radically different ways, which suggests that part of what the Book of Mormon is trying to do with Isaiah is to say, this isn't the fixed meaning, it isn't a fixed text. Prophecy is something that's living and breathing and interpretive, not there's its meaning. We're done with it.
It's like when Nephi talks about like he likes to liken the scriptures unto himself. It's like he actually does that like prophetically with some of the words of Isaiah.
Exactly. And the second argument the Book of Mormon stages, and this one's more nuanced and it's the climax of my book, but The second thing that the Book of Mormon argues is uh, that the question of historicity actually gets in the way of prophecy. Um, to see that takes, like I say, 300 pages of argument in my book. But I think that's actually you can show that the Book of Mormon is taking a position on how we ought to approach Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. It's not just God Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. It's telling you something about how to interact with that. And it seems to me that so much of what's been done about Isaiah and the Book of Mormon has made it impossible to see that the book is saying something about it and not just as it. You said earlier, and I think this is the common attitude, certainly the attitude I had growing up. It often just feels like the Isaiah stuff is filler, right? Like whenever Joseph Smith or Nephi, whoever, whatever your theory is, got bored or didn't know what to write next, they just thought, oh, let me copy some stuff from the
Right,
Bible.
right.
Um, but actually, it's integral, I think, to the project of the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon is staging an intervention about what it means to interact with Isaiah. And if that's right, then we really need to like set aside the question of whether Deutero-Isaiah belongs here and ask, what is it saying about this? And then we can ask whether it fits. Anyway, I've got a lot of strong feelings. I've written a lot about this because
We could probably do a
um,
whole separate episode on Isaiah. Well, this does lead me to ask the follow-up question about Deutero-Isaiah, and I probably see this as probably one of the strongest textual anachronisms going against the Book of
mhm,
Mormon. Some see it as this is a smoking gun against Book of Mormon historicity, that those chapters, it's 40 to 55, isn't it, that Bible scholars believe was written
yep,
by a different separate author from Isaiah after the Jewish exile into Babylon. So therefore, it wouldn't have been on the brass plates when Lehi existed. Therefore, it showing up shows it's sort of an anachronism, and Joseph would have assumed Isaiah authored the whole book of Isaiah, so that's why he included it. What's
yep.
your thoughts on it? You know, from a scholarly standpoint, do you see it as this is, a smoking gun, door shut? Do you think that there could have been perhaps earlier sort of primitive writings of Isaiah that could have existed, and then maybe they were brought with them in the exile, reworked, re-added by some of his followers or school of Isaiah? Do you think it could have been some just expansion to the text that Joseph channeled? What's your thoughts on the Isaiah problem and the different interpretations?
Good. I mean, essentially, I'm agnostic on what is the explanation. So, I mean, you've just, I think, done an admirable job of just giving like the whole run of options. Uh, I'm fine with any of them, right? I'm fine with the it's an expansion. I'm fine with there's some earlier traces of parts of Second Isaiah that then are just getting expanded in the exilic era. I'm fine with God gives Nephi words that he couldn't have had otherwise. I'm just literally dumps it into the Book of Mormon in the translation process. I'm fine with Joseph Smith. Feels like he can add stuff. I'm fine with any of these. Honestly, I'm just totally agnostic on the question of explaining how it got there. Part of the reason I'm agnostic, though, and this is worth saying, is not just that like I'm unsure as I look at the data. It's
Mm.
that it feels to me like it's a specialist's question. Um, if I had a PhD in Hebrew Bible and spent all of my time working on the 8th through about the 6th centuries BCE and in Israel, and really worked over Isaiah's text in great detail and blah 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 blah, right? As well as like maybe probably a second PhD in the history of Isaiah's reception in 19th century America and so on. And then maybe I could start to try to settle this question. But it really feels to me like it's a totally specialist question to decide how it got there.
So you're
The
saying we need
question
an
I think
LDS scholar who is a specialist in this. We need somebody to do that.
I really do think so. Yeah, I think a lot of what's happened is that when people say like, well, consensus in biblical scholarship is X on this, you're like, yeah, but there's literally no one who's even considered the possibility
We're challenging.
that, yeah, right, because they don't have any reason to, and so this is not there's nothing to criticize or blame there, right? On the other hand, we've literally never had a Latter Day Saint biblical scholar whose primary responsibility in graduate school was to get to the bottom of dating aspects of Isaiah. We just never have.
Mm.
We've got people who can say something about it because they're trained in this part of biblical history, but we don't have any actual specialist on this. So really, like, there's no jury at all yet, let alone like the jury is out. This is hyper specialized stuff to decide how to make sense of all the details. And there are lots of like, what assumptions does one make about blah blah blah. There's just so much at play there. I do think the question we can all address, and it doesn't require PhDs and super esoteric stuff, is like, what does Nephi say about Isaiah? Like, what is this text supposed to mean in this context, and so on? What's happening with it? And that's a question I think we can address right here and right now. And it's fascinating to me that I mean, since Sidney Sperry, so 100 years, we've talked about whether Isaiah belongs, right, in light of biblical scholarly consensus, and almost no conversation in 100 years about what the Isaiah stuff actually means.
Right.
So for my money, I'm going to try and flip that question around and say this is the question we should be asking.
No, I think it's good as well to acknowledge that because some people can maybe claim to have more expertise or speciality in this subject. I appreciate sometimes it's good to say that I probably can't determine it either way in some case. And a lot of the time that can be one of the frustrating things for
Mhm.
people who are trying to figure maybe things out like truth claims and stuff is that you're often having to defer to the experts as well because a lot of these things are beyond our own competence or we can read and what the different arguments are but we're not experts in them ourselves.
Exactly. I think this is actually Hugh Nibley's most important contribution. I think he's misread mostly, but I think Hugh Nibley's most important contribution is that he saw this point with real clarity. He What all of his apologetics amounted to was he was trying to make Latter-day Saints aware of how expertise does and doesn't work. I think that's actually what he was trying to do, is say, if someone shows up and tells you they've solved the problem, the Book of Mormon is a 19th century document, they're selling you something. Uh, they don't have the actual expertise to decide that question. And he says, if someone comes along and says, I've shown that it's an ancient document, that's settled, they're selling you something.
Yeah, it's not
We don't
simple,
have
cut
any
and
expert.
dry.
It's just not. If Yeah, he's constantly saying, if we actually care about this question, we'd all spend the rest of our lives in the libraries and the archives trying to see if we can get a first take on it. But no one's doing that. We're just all trying to convince each other we're in the right or the wrong religion,
Mm.
and pretending that we've got the intellectual authority to do that decisively. And I think he's absolutely right that that's a ridiculous kind of
Yeah,
claim.
and of course, biases are always going to play a part on both sides as well, and what information or evidence you want to present as well. It's hard to present all the data because, as I found since doing this series, I found some evidence or arguments in favor for the Book of Mormon, and if I just focus on them, it's like, well, of course it's true. But then
Yeah,
on the flip side, I found some good evidence or arguments going against the Book of Mormon, definitely that challenges it. And then if you just focus on that, you're like, wow, this is obviously made up and not historical. When you try to look at it, together, and again, how do you be objective? And then how you don't know if you have access to all the information on it as well, but it certainly makes it more complex.
yep.
So I want to ask maybe a couple of final questions before we wrap up. What's sort of like your thoughts on the nature of the translation? We often refer to apologetics type versus loose typing. Joseph Smith putting the stone in the hat and reading the words as they appeared, reading the translation very much tight word for word. There's sort of like looser or like an expansionist view that Joseph Smith, he is the translator. It's his language, his vocabulary. And is this a word for word translation of the plates, or there might be modern elements or even perhaps expansions under Blake Oster's view? Of course, it's kind of conjecture. None of us know for
Yep.
certainty what really went on. And perhaps that takes away from, the important thing, the text of the Book of Mormon. But do you hold a certain view when it comes to the nature of the translation and the text?
Not going to surprise you here. I don't, right? Um, and but for precisely the reason that, like, the question I'm going to have is, what difference does it make to the meaning of the text? So I will say, like, I get nervous about expansionist theories, not because I think they're unfaithful or because I think that they're ruled out by any of the historical evidence, but I get nervous about them because it becomes really convenient
I
interpretively.
was thinking that same thing. Any modern or anachronistic elements, clearly
I can just
19th century.
dismiss, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
question.
exactly. If I'm reading Alma 36 and I'm like, I don't like that portrait of Jesus, then I can just be like, oh, well, that's Joseph Smith. And then suddenly I can just invent whatever theology I want. So I get nervous about expansionist theories when they have interpretive implications. So if I default to a kind of assumption, if you will, I default to something like ridiculously tight control, but not because I'm theorizing strongly about that's what had to happen, that's the faithful position, or that's what makes the best sense of all of the historical evidence or whatever. It's that like I feel like my task as an interpreter is to take seriously the text that's been given me and then start from there. And if along the way, eventually I go, this is literally incoherent. Oh, maybe that's a 19th century expansion. Okay, right. But until I get to the point where I feel like this is incoherent without an assumption like that, I'll assume tight control. But that's an interpretive move, not a real theory of translation, right?
Right. So whenever I was in my faith crisis, and I actually a few years ago, I lost my faith and left the church for a bit, and then had experiences that brought me back a year or so later. But I was very much convinced, and I even still think that some of the naturalistic explanations for the Book of Mormon, I see some of them as plausible or reasonable or compelling. I think Grant Palmer and Dan Vogel's were probably, the strongest ones that I'd read, and they would kind of say that like you could explain a lot of the Book of Mormon from five main sources. Say the King James Bible, Old and New Testament, Joseph taken from his own father's dream and his family sort of autobiographical material, some of the sermons or conversion experiences in the Book of Mormon sounding very Protestant or like Methodist that Joseph might have heard at revivals, some of the doctrine as well, the Galilean robbers sort of being influenced from like anti-Masonic rhetoric, and like the view of the Hebrews or like the mound builder myth for like the Nephite and Lamanite narrative, Israelites coming to the Americas, they're being cursing with dark skin. And they would say, like, combine that with Joseph's just imagination and sort of creative genius. That is a naturalistic explanation that explains, how Joseph Smith did it. And then you have maybe William Davis, who has this sort of laying down heads theory that Joseph had a rough mental outline, and then he was just able to orally sort of extemporaneously, expand and just dictate off it. What do you
Right.
think of those naturalistic explanations? I assume you don't find them persuasive, but what are your thoughts on them? And why don't you feel like that fully accounts for this is where the Book of Mormon came from?
Um, it's a really important question. It's less that I don't find them persuasive, though I don't, right? But it's less that than that it just feels to me like they're too early. Um, in other words, it's something like early medicine, right? So you go back and look at medical practices in the 17th century. Um, it's not that these are absolutely horrendous theories, though some of them, let's be clear, are, or whatever, right? It's
Yeah,
just
like,
that literally we've gathered so little data, we've understood so little. Cell theory is 150 years away. We don't even understand germs yet, right? Uh, and so what we're doing is we've got a little bit of data, and then we're trying to come up with a big grand theory to explain the thing. And so my concern with those kinds of approaches is mostly just that they work when we haven't studied the Book of Mormon in detail yet, right? Or they're compelling when we haven't really studied the text yet. But one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years in the field is that there's just so much close reading going on and so much more interesting stuff being found in the Book of Mormon than we've ever seen. And at some point you have to pause and then say, okay, so if you take just Grant Hardy's understanding the Book of Mormon, take every insight he's got there, does Vogel's theory still work as a theory? And it starts to look like, well, it can account for this, but it can't account for that. And it starts to look a little too sketchy, too broad, right?
the
It's
gap.
too, yeah, exactly. And Hardy's book is, of course, just like the very beginning, the very beginning. Um, so what happens if we do like really intense, close work on all kinds of parts of the Book of Mormon? Then I think we can go back and measure those theories. But for now, they're too early. They're such broad brush. Uh, they're so capacious, but it's precisely because they're coming at a time when no one's actually read the Book of Mormon carefully or closely. William Davis, of course, is more recent than, say, Vogel's hypothesis. But uh, but even William Davis, like his book is, I think, really interesting, and there's a lot of compelling stuff there.
Hmm.
But you take like his okay, you're laying down heads for, say, First Nephi, right? And he's, oh, there's this big long heading for First Nephi that's laying down where the book is going to go. But if we study First Nephi in detail, how well does the outline match up with the book and its actual structure and so on? And Davis hasn't considered any of that, though there's a lot of work that's been done on First Nephi in the last handful of years. So when I read Davis's book, I thought, yeah, that just doesn't make any sense at First Nephi. It's an interesting theory, and there's some compelling stuff there, but it's compelling only when you're ignoring all the details of First
Hmm.
Nephi. So I think that this is my general response to these: is I see how they're compelling, but I think they're compelling um, because they're at such a distance, right? If you're 10,000 feet up, it's easy to give a shape of a city that's compelling. But once you're on the ground, you're like, well, actually, right? Um,
Do you feel like they're almost
so
a little bit like, I don't want to say simplistic, but do you feel like it waters down the richness and the complexity of the Book of Mormon, and maybe doesn't always fully account
yeah,
for what we might see as like evidence in favor as well?
yeah, sort of. I mean, I think it's not that they water it down; it's that people just these theories have come at a time when people just haven't done the work yet. So everyone's got a watered down Book of Mormon, and so it makes sense, right?
Sure.
But I think once we start to deal in the details, we're like, actually, this is more complicated. I don't know that it sifts out evidence in favor necessarily. I don't think I'd want to go so far. But it does just feels to me like there are theories that make sense because there's not nearly enough data to work with. Um, yeah, if you've got a theory of like, oh, I think the flu is actually because you walked through the wrong humors and you've got a melancholic bile or something like that. That makes perfect sense when you don't know anything about germs. You just haven't done any microscopic work yet, right? But we're starting to do microscopic work on the Book of Mormon, and it turns out there might be whole other things going on here.
Mm.
Even if it's Joseph Smith's creation, there are whole other things going on here that have to be accounted for, and it would make for a very different picture, even on a secular.
Right. I remember like over a year ago, I might be getting some of the details wrong, but I remember I did a video on like Methodist sermons. I know Grant Palmer argued in his book that King Benjamin's sermon sounds very similar. It was like I think a Methodist preacher, was it Benjamin Paddock? Or no, I think there was a Benjamin on the stand, but it was Bishop McKendry or something gave this address, and he made all these parallels. And then I remember, looking into it, and then Fair said that one, I think he wasn't even there in attendance, and he was kind of like having to like change a lot of things to make that fit. But then other sort of scholars had said that there seems to be some also connections to like coronation ceremony and like Feast of Tabernacles as well with what's happening, with King Benjamin's sermon. I remember like it kind of made me realize that like, oh, maybe he's overstretching his case. The argument isn't as strong, or it's definitely not a smoking gun to it as well. And I was like, oh, you could also interpret that and view it as, okay, maybe it could be like a Methodist camp revival, but then there's also some similarities to a Feast of Tabernacles. So I kind of saw it as like, oh, it doesn't force me to view it as like this is clearly 19th century.
Right. And I would go, I'd take it a step or two further, right? So recent work on Benjamin's sermon at a theological and literary level has gone way further. So, for example, there are a bunch of literary connections between Mosiah 3, which is the angel's words Benjamin quotes,
Yes.
and then Benedict, right? There are all these links between those two sermons. And these are the only two major sermons in the book of Mosiah. And suddenly you start to go, okay, so what's happening here? You've got a king who's announcing the words of an angel to his people. And over here, you've got a prophet who's standing in front of the king. Wait, there's something going on here, right? There's a kind of interesting contrast between two political settings for the announcement of Christ's birth. And then, anyway, and you just detail, 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 detail. It turns out there's actually a whole lot of literary complexity here that Camp Revival doesn't even begin to make sense of. For example, King Benjamin's angel, his whole theology of Christ's atonement is about blood. Blood gets mentioned over and over and over and over and over again. Blood atones for this, and blood atones for this, and blood atones for this. And his image of Christ is royal. He's the king who reigns, who comes down from his throne on high, and so on. So you've got this image of like blood, sacrifice, priestly sacrifice, and this royal imagery for Christ. But when you look at the similar sermon in Abinadi, um, not once does Abinadi connect Christ's atonement to blood. Not at all. It's never about blood.
Hmm.
Instead, the image he uses is simple submission, a sheep being shorn.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, and then when he talks about Christ, he talks about him as father and son. It's domestic imagery. So suddenly, like, oh, interesting. When the king is on his tower as the righteous figure, Christ is royal and his priests are righteous, and so it's blood and so on is this sacrificial imagery. You go to Abinadi where you've got corrupt kings and priests, and Christ is not a king; he's a father and a son. And this is not blood. We're not going to give any credit to your priestly institution. This is about the gesture of submission. And suddenly you go, wow, there's a ton going on here that, let's say Joseph is like trying to port into the Book of Mormon something about camp revivals. Then he went light years beyond that and trying to think about blood atonement versus non-blood atonement and thinking about royal Christian imagery versus anti-royal Christian imagery. And like camp revival just suddenly looks like it's what you could see 10,000 feet up. But once you're on the ground, there's all kinds of other stuff going on there. And it now feels really cheap to just be like, well, camp revival, that explains Benjamin's sermon.
Wow. No, really good points. I had a thought in my head. I can't remember what it was. Well, sort of like a wrapping up question then. What if, and I imagine from listening to you that you are understanding of those people who maybe don't believe the Book of Mormon is inspired or historical, and historicity isn't your main focus, like focusing more on like the theological messages and the complexity of the text and the spiritual sort of richness that we can get from it. But what if somebody were to say that they just feel that there's lots of either textual or physical anachronisms in the text, and they don't feel like there's enough archaeological evidence for them to have spiritual belief or faith in the book? What would be your response to that? Do you think that's fair or valid, or do you think that they're sort of misguided if they take that stance?
I mean, it would a lot of it would depend on the context and the person and that kind of thing. But generally, I think what I'd want to say to if someone's sitting in my office and we're having that conversation or whatever, um, I think what I'd want to say is, I mean, recognize that you've made an assumption that that's the thing that decides the truth of the book. Um, and if that assumption feels right, then there's not much I can say. But it does feel to me like I don't share that assumption, right? Um, so you've got a different filter on as you're coming at the Book of Mormon than I do. So my argument with that person would be about the filter rather than about the details of the anachronisms and so on. I'd be like, yeah, that's anachronistic, sure. That's anachronistic, sure. Fine, fine, fine. But that's not the issue for me, right? The issue is like, what? How do we decide the truth of the Book of Mormon? And anachronisms just feel to me like they have nothing to do with the question. So that's what I'd try to engage the conversation with. Not that I'd say like you're deluded, you've just got it all wrong. I would just be like, boy, I understand this whole question in a totally different way. Let's talk about that instead of whether there's an anachronism in that chapter.
Right. And what would you say is what is your foundation for your belief and your testimony in the truth of the Book of Mormon? And it's probably coming from a personal perspective as well, but you
Yeah,
can tie in things from scholarship. But what's sort of your foundation?
yeah. I mean, it's too flip in a certain way to say it's spiritual, but that's what it is, right? Like I feel a deep conviction regarding the book, but also like I'm deeply compelled by the theology of the book, right? So if I want to shift into a slightly more intellectual frame, um, the more I read in the Book of Mormon carefully, the more I'm just floored by and find like existential truth in what it teaches about the life of faith. The way that the Book of Mormon explains grace, for instance, uh, I don't think anything truer has been said about what it is to live a life well than what the Book of Mormon has to say about grace. Um, and that, I mean, literally has made the difference between misery and happiness in my life, right? Um, the Book of Mormon has taught me more about how to slow down and pay attention and so on in ways that genuinely make my life better. So I have a spiritual conviction, but quite apart from that, what I find in the book is stuff that constantly makes me a better person. And so I stick with it.
That's awesome. Well, Joe, this has been a really great interview. I've loved this time to talk to you about the Book of Mormon and to pick your brain and ask you a bunch of questions about both complexity and your thoughts on historicity. And I really appreciate the great work that you do and your insights. Is there any books or any articles you would like to plug specifically for my listeners related to this topic before I let you go? And I'll promote them.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I hate to promote my own work. I'm a kid of the '90s. That always feels icky, but
Yeah,
uh,
that's
but I
what you're
will.
here for.
But I will mention. I mean, a lot of the questions we've been talking about with historicity, I've written a lot about this kind of reframing that we've talked about over and over, and a lot of my essays that deal with that have all been gathered in a little collection, 2-volume collection published by Guilford Books called The Anatomy of Book of Mormon Theology. So if these kinds of questions get people excited, like, oh, how do we think about historicity? And is there another way to think about the Book of Mormon? That's certainly what I would recommend from my work, is The Anatomy of Book of Mormon Theology.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the link in, and thanks again for coming on. It was great to meet you and have this chat, and I'll stay in touch. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this, give it a like, comment underneath your thoughts as well, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content and interviews with great scholars like Joe. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website, and you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.